With the Runaway 5 dropping us off, we're stranded in Threed, and I mean stranded. No way out forwards or backwards. The oppressive atmosphere of the night overcast on Threed and its spooky music really sell that feeling that you're stuck here. It's beautiful. This old woman badgers you for smiling in such depressing times, and this along with the Runaway 5 suggesting you heal the town with your own little brand of sunshine go pretty hand in hand. It really speaks to the learned helplessness people experience in their everyday lives, and is a clever play on healing the townspeople's hope as well as what saving Threed eventually leads to. Also note that Threed is drenched in blue. This con man in the house is really interesting. He says he double-crossed the zombies overrunning town, who are apparently ruled over by Belch, who in turn works for Gygas. The interesting part though is the explicit suggestion that Gygas is possibly female. This is interesting because it sets up Gygas as a sort of foil from Mother Nature, a symbol of all that is natural. It's a complicated thing to unpack because there is text later that seemingly outright contradicts this. However, I interpret this as a suggestion of an intentional ambiguity in Gygas' gender. Sure, there's what I just said about Mother Nature, but with Gygas being a sort of symbol for evil in general, it's more likely Gygas is meant to be a foil to the traditional understanding of God, who is all good and has masculine and feminine qualities, although explicitly neither. We'll revisit this down the road though, as this split in interpretation very much leads to some really interesting meaning to be extrapolated later. Also, this is a wild color palette for a house. This fella informs you there's supposedly a secret path to the northwest, but it's guarded by zombies, also saying it leads to a path with a very powerful monster. The woman in this house drops some lore that apparently Belch possibly knows some form of necromancy, promising to give the zombies, quote, their lives back. This mouse loves you, and this girl says something interesting. Hey, you don't look so happy. You better cheer up or you'll become a zombie. In terms of the game's literal story, this line may have one of two meanings, and many more implications. One, it could just be a metaphor. Or, this could mean that not only are the zombies seeing the living dead, but are also those seduced by the evil enveloping the town as well. Which would make sense, as several NPCs mention people either becoming tools of the zombies or even straight up working for them. This would suggest that those who are unhappy are more susceptible to the zombies' coercion. On a subtextual level, however, this offers even more to us as players, but to understand its meaning we need to lay something out. What do the zombies represent? To me, I see the zombies as representing those who have given up hope in their lives. The zombies form a sort of structure under Belch, their leader, so they're his militia more or less, but as we'll see later, Belch also runs a factory, so beyond just his political role, Belch also represents corporations somewhat. It's a bit of a spider web, but if the zombies represent those without hope, Belch, being a political and economical figure, would then represent the system, the institution. And those who feel gotten down by the institutions of the world are more likely to eventually just accept their role in it, becoming effectively a zombie. And the motivation for becoming a zombie and likewise slave to Belch? A chance of revival, to get their lives back. Subtextually, a chance at enough power and resources to no longer have to be part of the system and to be alive again. One step further, what's everyone's biggest fear of the zombies? Being eaten by them. Consumed. Even becoming one themselves. North, there's a don't enter sign. Oh, never mind, guess it doesn't say that. Many won't leave their homes, and those who do certainly aren't happy about it. Town's a buzzing at the center of it though, this guy mentioning having seen a suspicious woman talking with the zombies. Inside the circus tent, appropriately colored orange to complement the blue surroundings, something also played on by the abundance of Halloween-themed enemies, a meeting is taking place to decide what to do about the zombies. Heading towards the very north of the graveyard, the party encounters two zombies who stare into your soul. Average day. Back in town, this guy points out the suspicious woman mentioned before is outside the hotel, and that regardless of the people she's been hanging around, he'd like to, quote, spend some time with her, exclamation point. Just over, there she is, in what appears to be a very revealing outfit. When the player moves closer to her, she goes in front of the hotel, leaving the player to get closer and then follow her inside. In the hotel, a highly distorted version of the usual hotel theme plays. Something's off. The player then follows the mysterious, scantily clad woman into her hotel room. Now, hold on. Let's take a second here and dissect this, because oh boy, does this look compromising. So let's take a second and compile and analyze all the information we've received about this woman. Here's what we know. 1. She has been seen hanging around with the zombies. Why would that be? Well, we know the zombies have been recruiting everyday helpless people into their ranks. Now, why would a woman of this sort be in this position amongst the zombies? Well, I have a theory. One that I doubt many have ever considered about this woman and why she's with the zombies, and it's not for the reason you freaks probably think. The common interpretation is that she's more or less a trashy prostitute, and the main character follows her into a hotel room for some reason. Well, let's think about this. Why are we following her here? We know she's been seen with the zombies who are guarding the underground path we need to check out, so logic follows that the reason we're pursuing her is that she probably knows something. You perverts. However, you're also perverts correctly. Here's my theory. I believe this woman was likely not too long before the events of the game started, an average person with some less socially frowned upon occupation. Then the fog came, the darkness, and she became helpless, leading the zombies to start preying on her, and over time influencing her until she eventually became more loose about her appearance. Now the zombies are ruled over by Belch, and Belch is ruled by Gygas, the ultimate antagonist, who is actively attacking the past to prevent the main character from defeating her. Now, if you're hellbent on ruling over and destroying everything ever, and the Achilles heel to your plan is a 13-year-old boy, how would you lure him in and trap him? You dangle a practically naked woman in front of him. She was used, just a tool for Gygas to exploit. So yes, there's absolutely a layer of sexual provocation going on here. The protagonist is a boy just entering puberty. He's hormonal as hell. Of course this would get his attention. Now the backstory I'm proposing for her has no backing, but given all the information the player receives from the game's text about the social politics of Threed, I do not think this is some sort of stretch, and even if you disagree with those assumptions I've made, that still leaves the part of her body being used as bait for a teenager completely intact. And it's also likely she's hypnotized, which is why she's wearing sunglasses, presumably to hide her possession eyes. This I'm drawing from text spoken by a character is very possibly this same one later in the game, so we'll get to that when we get to it. Okay. Entering the room, the horn dog protagonist gets beaten to a pulp. Waking up in a strange place and finding that the only door out is locked, the female protagonist prays, calling out to a friend they're yet to meet. The atmosphere of being trapped here is thick. The door is metal, the floor is bare ground, and in junction with blue lighting of the room, it just feels cold. With there being no windows and no proper floor, the player can deduce that there's somewhere underground, which adds to the feeling of despair. Being trapped somewhere that's not only uncomfortable in general, but somewhere nobody can hear you. The female protagonist's prayer truly is their only hope. As the screen transitions from Threed to a small country to the north, Winters, the mood shifts slightly. In comparison to the upbeat and predominantly more extreme vibes the soundtrack has had up to this point, there's a melancholy overtone to this moment, one that leaves the player in a state of, where do we go from here? The camera then lands on Snowwood boarding house, as it brings the player into the dorm of the third character they named at the beginning. As the femcee's prayer reaches him, the music shifts to a tone reminiscent of the sanctuary locations. A moment of sanctity in this dark moment is found as the player is let know that the kid's cries for help are at least being heard by somebody. With this, the player takes control of the third protagonist, and the music stops. This is done to let the attention of the player fall on the controls, as they'll see the character not moving, letting them know that this is no longer a cutscene. Tony, the character's roommate, says he dreamt that they were taking a walk together. This is the first sprout of an overarching story that will be told throughout the background of the rest of the game, which we'll address as it comes up. As the player attempts to leave the room, Tony jumps out of bed to warn him of the consequences of sneaking out of the dorms at night. When Tony asks why he's leaving, he continues by saying there must be some reason that he doesn't understand. This is the first look at the other half of the two's relationship. That the blonde boy seemingly didn't respond or was vague in answering while Tony leapt to his feet to warn him of the trouble he could be facing. There's an apparent slight dissonance in their relationship. Feelings are weighted more to one side than the other. This suggests both a slight coldness to this protagonist, or at least something of a shyness to him, and something of an obliviousness in regards to relationship. He's just a bit more literal and logical in approach. He's heading south towards the other protagonist because he was blatantly told to do just that. I'm inclined, however, to think both these feelings are present rather than one or the other, and we'll be getting a better look into his psyche later in this sequence. But I feel as though this isn't me just reading into this with him being quiet here, as he very much can and does talk throughout the rest of the game. Tony mentions there's things that could help him in the locker room and tags along to help him for the time being. The track Snowman then continues playing. There's a heaviness to the song that gives the cold winter night this moment takes place during an oppressive and big feel. This section of the game has a sort of underdog undertone to it. Like the challenges this character is about to face are going to be greater than many of the ones that have been seen before. This makes sense, as this character is also the first protagonist we've met who is not endowed with the PSI abilities. For the first time, this really is just a kid against the world. His room has tools strewn about it, and his inventory contains some more, as well as a big bottle rocket, which the help function tells the player is a one-use item that inflicts lots of damage when used by him. This tells the player that this boy may not have magic, but he's a whiz with the mechanical. Heading out of the dorm room, there's a group of students gathered. The one in black mentions hearing of a creature named Tessie that lives in the southern lake, but doesn't believe it, suggesting it was faked. This is a reference to the actual Loch Ness monster, which was confirmed to be a hoax, being a model placed in a lake, and sets the player up with what to vaguely expect going forward, and what to make of a later area. The student in green mentions a rumored entrance at Stonehenge. Again, this sets the player up with information they need to know, but in an intriguing and mysterious way. The one in blue mentions cave boys being spotted around Stonehenge. This boy says he's going to bed. These three stories make for a perfect storm of absurdity for this area that is comical, though I'll explain further once all this finishes adding up. In the dorm next to the protagonists, there are several presents with cookies in them that the player can take. The boy in orange mentions tomorrow's Tony's birthday, and that these presents are to be party favors. In spite of this, the player can still choose to take as many as they want, which results in the boy saying, "I can't believe you would do something so nasty." This is another moment that really stands out due to the medium in which it's being delivered. For one, with many of the presents being placed so close to where the player enters, it feels like this whole thing is a setup slanted towards them, as up to this point there has been no consequence for taking others' things, and has even been encouraged. And although the consequences don't go past someone commenting on how rude it is, it's still somewhat shocking to the point it's funny. And on top of all this, Tony will say nothing no matter what the player does, and it inadvertently shows how much he cares for the protagonists above all else. So, after taking them all, the other boy in the room recommends seeing Maxwell, who he says always looks out for the younger students, and is presumably a teacher at the boarding school. He says he's downstairs in the lab, and that there's many dangerous animals wandering outside. Other than the direction given to the player, this also shows Gygas's influence has spread far beyond just the Americas, where the game thus far has taken place, but even all the way across the ocean to Europe, as Winters is based on a few different European countries. Just another moment of reinforcing Gygas's otherworldly power. Downstairs and into the lab, Maxwell tells of a project he's struggling with. He then reveals the protagonist's father is someone named Dr. Andonuts, a brilliant scientist beyond the likes of even Einstein and Heisenberg, although he's eccentric. He then gives the player the key to the locker. By using this key on each and every locker, the player will see it doesn't work for any of them. Back to Maxwell, he gives the player his completed project, the machine that opens doors especially when you have a slightly bent key. After this, he explains that the character can repair small gadgets and tools, having inherited some of his father's brains, though this exact process could be made clearer. The player can only achieve this by resting somewhere with a high enough IQ stat for the character while a broken item is in his inventory. Though this process gets partially explained through gameplay later, the IQ stat component should have been made clearer in some way, and could even just have been done in blatant video game terms, as this character makes a blatant comparison to video games only just before this moment. The player can then get the pop gun, a weapon for this character. This is a bit of a step up from the bats and pans the other characters have used thus far. And this makes sense, as this character has no magical capabilities. Therefore, his weapons do need to be a bit more violent to make up for this lack of powers. This really is a kid against the world. Leaving the boarding house, Tony will go up ahead and help the player jump the gate, informing them that they'll always be best friends, and then runs back inside before security can have the chance to catch him. This whole segment of escaping from a boarding school is a fun concept, and by running into the woods, it gives the scene the tone of a prison escape. That this moment for this character is them breaking out of what his life had previously been restrained to. That this moment is where his adventure and his life truly begin. and this is signified by the more upbeat but still oppressively cold Winter's White starting to play. The nearby building reads, Drugstore, Best Friend, a sort of juxtaposition to the moment that just transpired between the protagonist and Tony, who said they'd be best friends forever. Who's this drugstore getting in the way of that? Well, it's a harsh reality for the character, as tough as the winter here itself. That now that he's on his own and free, he has to survive the harsh conditions of the world. Shelter and resources for now anyway. Those are his best friend. Inside we meet the greatest character in all of fiction, Bubble Monkey, who says, and I quote verbatim, "Yeah." At the front counter, the player will quickly see they can afford nothing. Well, at least by the intended means anyway. The nearby woman implores the protagonist to take the monkey, since he's noisy, and for only the cost of a pack of bubblegum. Or pack. A change made for character limits, but one I can at least appreciate works sort of within the context of the 90s, which did that sort of only K and X thing a lot to make things seem cooler. The game will also tell you it is Balloon Monkey. Wait, Balloon? Yeah, this is just a typo. In Mother 2, this character's name is Balloon Monkey, but was localized to Bubble Monkey, and this is the remnant of an earlier translation. Though not a huge issue, it does sort of obscure something the localization does to make its use more obvious, though it doesn't take much brain power to figure out what to do with it, especially for this guy. This NPC initially talks about the huge bubbles the gum lets him blow, but afterwards will ask about the weather. When talking to Bubble Monkey again, he'll directly ask for the gum. The change to Bubble Monkey was a good one, as the word bubble has a much clearer connection to bubblegum than balloon does. But really, no harm, no foul. He then does his iconic pose, then joins the player. Time to hit the road and head south. My clear bias towards Bubble Monkey aside, he is a great character in the story. Though we haven't really brought it up, the player's guide does give some additional information about him. I won't be discussing this too much, but as it came with the game when it was released, most players would have had it, and seeing as we're covering what we can draw from the American version of the game, I thought it was worth mentioning. But that said, I won't be referring to it, and will be sticking to what's in the game, although it's technically canon. Bubble Monkey himself does some pretty fun things when following the player. He stops and looks around before running to catch up as the protagonist walks, which is a fun detail that did demand extra work on the programmer's parts. It's such a little thing, but it brings this character to life so much more. In battle, he'll also attack pretty regularly, making him useful outside of plot reasons. He's a weird little guy, a monkey in a climate like this. Yeah, there are primates that inhabit colder places like this, but look at this guy's fur. He's not from around here. He doesn't belong, yet lives here and is happy. While our hero belongs here, but is giving it his all to get out. They're two misfits whose contrast from one another makes it make just so much sense they've been paired together. I also appreciate how the backgrounds for some enemies reflect this cold climate. It makes the battles feel tied to where they're taking place, as the green background of the runaway dogs helped connect their fights to Onett. Further down, the player will arrive at a tent. Here the player can heal, which will be nice after the gruff goat they likely encountered. Those guys are tough and are frankly a bit poorly balanced, as the player pretty much gets the time for one attack in before having to heal and wait for them to either miss or waste a turn to get another one in. This battle was probably meant to force the player to get desperate and use their big bottle rocket to teach them how powerful they are, but seeing as the player only gets one for this area, and there's more gruff goats later, this could have been handled much better. Eventually, the player reaches the Tessie Watching Club. These two talk about giving Bubble Monkey some gum, and that Tessie appears when the wind is blowing. This watcher speculates Tessie is hiding in the woods, which is a sort of part 1 to a joke that'll be completed in just a minute. Inside this tent, there's a phone to save and another watcher who's looking for some quick recognition. A detail to appreciate about the tents, by the way, is that while inside them, the music recedes, giving a slight illusion of some privacy from the game itself, like the player really is taking a break from the adventuring to save and rest. This watcher tells the player that they might see Tessie the next day, a cue that the player needs to rest in this tent to progress. Inside, this NPC offers the protagonist, and hopefully Bubble Monkey, some stew. This is a nice moment. The protagonist in this short time away from the school has already been through a lot, and it just feels right for him to get a short break in a nice warm place with some hot food before he continues. Overnight, he receives another message from the female protagonist, reminding the player of their goal. Just after, the protagonist fixes the broken spray can into defense spray, both demonstrating how the protagonist's repairability functions, and being a helpful item for this very moment in the game, with plenty of tougher enemies just up ahead. After waking up and heading outside, the sun rises and the wind starts blowing. The music also conveys the sense that a big event is brewing, just as is the weather. By heading to the by heading to this patch of dirt that clearly conveys it's a place of importance due to its total visual distance from the surrounding area and the nearby whirlpool, Bubble Monkey will then use the gum to blow a bubble, drawing Tessie above the water. This completes the joke of this NPC to anyone not familiar with the Loch Ness Monster, as clearly this would never be out in the forest. The protagonist then climbs aboard and rides Tessie as she takes the two across to the other side. A triumphant track plays, eliciting the feeling of just how far the player has come, not just in this sequence, but in the entire game. What better time to stop, breathe, and think about how many crazy situations they've overcome than while riding on the back of a sea monster? On the other side, and continuing south, the player encounters another pencil statue, foreshadowing that this won't be the player's last time in Winters. The sign advertises a dungeon that the player can go through for free, setting the tone for the meta nature of this next section. Inside, the sign welcomes the player to the modest dungeon they've stepped into, created by a brick road. Inside is a very rudimentary maze of repeated tiles with some items, dead ends, and several unavoidable fights. A lot of tough fights too at that. This dungeon is somewhat reminiscent of many early RPG games, particularly that of the first Dragon Quest game, even having, for all intents and purposes, slimes to fight. Worthless protoplasms. This doesn't seem to be done in a mocking way though, more so in an endearing way, in a way very reverent of them. Also, I like this joke. The section comes across as a sort of meta-commentary on the very game design process itself. Shigesato Itoi, the director of the game, is a great admirer of the Dragon Quest games, and was an avid player of the early entries. It was these games that inspired much of his design philosophy for his own games, and this section seems to pay tribute to those grandfathers to the RPG genre as we know it. With this, he's saying, I thought creating an RPG was as simple as laying out areas and placing objects, but that's only the very fundamentals, the building blocks of what a game needs, and even these things have much more depth than just placing them. It's very adoring of what it is in that way. It respects the genre and its conventions while daring to step outside them to redefine it itself. The section concludes with a sign congratulating the player and requesting they come back sometime. Just outside, the player meets this brick road. He's a dungeon developer who is seeking Dr. Andonuts' help to become a dungeon man, a chimera of dungeon and man. Brick Road is a surrogate character for a game designer, or more broadly, any type of artist. Someone looking to become so in tune with their craft that they become a manifestation of it. More on this much later though. He heals the player and we continue on our way. Into the nearby cave, there's a pretty straightforward path with no enemies that are too difficult, though they still pit the player against some tricky foes. While previous caves so far have had mainly brown color palettes with warmer colors like yellow and red mixed in, the caves themselves felt warmer, which was reflective of their greater settings in the world of the game. This cave does the same, but in the opposite direction, opting for a cooler color palette, consisting of hues of green and blue, which adds to the coldness of the surrounding climate. It's a small thing, but it does add another layer of cohesion to the game world, to make it all feel like it truly fits together. This cave does at a couple points feel like it's setting up the player for failure though, with some wildcard enemies. However, this isn't remotely as much of an inconvenience as it would be if this solo section was played as any of the other protagonists, who would lose all their magic power upon getting a game over, while this one, since he doesn't have it, has nothing to lose. And with a save point not too far back from here, it's not a huge deal. This part with the rope can be a bit tricky, but seeing as the player has been exposed thus far to 2 different instances of Bubble Monkey using gum to float, it's not too much of a stretch to see that as the solution here. Though this is also the only instance in which the player themselves has to use the pack of bubblegum to get it to trigger. It's a hit or miss moment, but with that said, rope high up, monkey go high. It's not that complicated. But I do see why some may get stumped here for a minute, as key items throughout the game are rarely situational like this, with the vast majority of them being ones to use while talking to someone or on a clear object, like doors or the pencil statue. Heading up the rope, the player will see a sanctuary guardian. The lack of any sort of oral build-up to this moment, or at least the unwitting build-up, as the ambience is quite unnerving, will give new players a sense of stress, as bosses up to this point haven't been exactly easy. With the limited items received and no way of using healing PSI, players will be torn on whether to approach it or not. By doing so, they'll be informed that only the main character can proceed. This will alleviate the tension, but also reaffirms that the focus of the game's story is the main protagonist, and this reminder might be somewhat warranted, as it could have taken players several minutes to get to this point in the section, and with their attention on the threats at hand, it may have slipped their mind that they're trying to get back to save the other two characters. On the other side, another monkey will be encountered, one that Bubble Monkey is quite fond of. He pursues her and leaves the party. This makes sense, as the player is now in the final stretch of the section, making his extra damage not very useful, and it makes sense on a story level, as this out-of-place character finds someone like him to now belong here with, therefore he should be with her. What I am not fond of is what can easily happen right after this. The players now reach Stonehenge, which, like the boy back at the boarding house said, is crawling with cave boys. While possible to defeat, cave boys are significantly tougher than everything encountered thus far, even surpassing the gruff goats, and by this point the player is more likely to be low on recovery items, and with the hit or miss chances of successfully fleeing from battle, it's very possible players can die here, and if they do so after Bubble Monkey leaves the party, he won't return for their second trek through the cave. What the hell? I do like the play on cave boys as a clear homage to the Sasquatch though. In the middle of Stonehenge, like another boy said, there's an entrance. Going down will bring the player to some sort of alien area, conveyed by the purple and green flashing colors, which are often associated with extraterrestrial imagery. The way forward is blocked, however, by a giant eraser statue. Ha ha. This again reiterates the player will return here at some point, and also is just a clever joke. Upon leaving? Yeah. Another thing I don't care for is when exiting the underground, it's very possible the player will just be instantly spawned into a battle with a cave boy. BS. Now that we've mentioned the alien-like area though, I'd like to follow up on something mentioned earlier. This country has the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, presumably aliens, and Stonehenge. The absurdity of this area is comedic. This man refers to the protagonist as "you kids," which is clearly a typo meant to be seen at a later time. Blatant error, whoops. He confirms the presence of extraterrestrials here, and just further south, the player reaches the lab. Inside, a much more peaceful theme plays. A nice breather after the tough section the player just faced. Inside, the protagonist reunites with someone the player is meeting for the first time. This is Dr. Andonuts. He mistakes the protagonist for someone referred to him by Brick Road, only to realize he's his son. It's implied the protagonist corrected him, meaning he spoke, demonstrating the importance of this moment to him. Andonuts addresses that it's been about 10 years since they last saw each other. This character canonically is 13 years old in the American localization, meaning he hasn't seen his father since he was about 3, and with no other parent present, it seems up to this point he's been pretty much on his own. Suddenly his distance from even his best friend makes more sense. Suddenly a call to him one night that someone desperately needs his help and him getting out of bed and instantly pursuing it makes more sense. From here, there's an awkwardness to the conversation. He offers the character a donut. While this may seem like an arbitrary moment, I mean, it doesn't affect anything gameplay-wise, it's a pretty important character moment that the player has direct input over. By saying yes, Andonuts reveals he doesn't actually have any. Both elevating the awkwardness of the scene while playing on his father's absence has also probably led to many other unfulfilled promises. By answering no, Andonuts just sort of brushes it off, clearly trying to give his son some space. He then asks if he's seen Stonehenge, which either way he'll reply with, "Well, at least I asked." Probably due to the protagonist's one-word answers to his questions, taking away he likely doesn't have much to say to him. Andonuts finds out the female protagonist probably sensed him, and knows he must help his son to get to her. Why does he know about the significance of this? I don't know. This doesn't get elaborated on at any point, he just sort of knows. This could be one of two things. 1, a plot hole, or 2, hearing his son say that the message he received from her has led him all the way from his school through the dangerous conditions of winters probably speaks to him. And the fact that he's been in such little contact with his son could be what makes it so important to him to help him to get to her. I prefer the latter interpretation. He mentions he's in the process of building a phase distorter to connect 2 points in space and time, foreshadowing for later in a clever way, as its use would be helpful here, it's just not complete yet though, leading him to offer the Skyrunner. Just nice to see foreshadowing done in a natural way to the scene, as it's some of the most difficult kind of dialogue to write without being heavy-handed. He gives the character authorization to use the Skyrunner, and suggests they get back together in another 10 years or so, showing he's, for the moment at least, content with the distant relationship the two share. This is something so important about what separates this game from other RPGs of the time. Just how real its characters can get, and how true they can be to life. Even with a name as silly as something like Dr. Donuts, so far all the characters have come from different types of home situations. The main character from a single mother household with a tending and close mother, the female protagonist from one with two parents who both care deeply for her, and now this character with only a distant father. More on this another time when we meet our fourth hero, but I wanted to mention it. Upstairs is also a broken pipe, which I appreciate being placed in a lab as broken parts as a result of experiments is an organic reason for why they'd be here. By entering the Skyrunner, the protagonist takes off to the skies towards Threed, on the way passing over many areas the player will see in the not too distant future. Finally reaching Threed, the third hero makes it to the graveyard and crashes. Finally meeting our other two heroes, he introduces himself. Someone who's not very strong, really nearsighted, kind of shy, and a bit reckless, but nonetheless someone who's dedicated to be your friend and ally. Will you accept his friendship? No. So why'd you call me? Are you just making fun of me? Okay, you can come along. With our third party member, we are now still locked inside. But wait, the machine that opens doors, especially when you have a slightly bent key. Yes, all that atmosphere, all that character development, all that fighting, hardship, and flying was for that joke. This game's amazing. By exiting the underground, the player definitively finds out they were trapped under the graveyard. They were in an even deader spot than previously thought. Outside once again though, the player is left a bit aimless, with the only real possible idea of what to do is to try and get back at the woman from earlier, which would lead them around here, likely leading them to seeing NPCs rushing into the tent. Inside, the player will learn the townspeople are trying to figure out how to get rid of the zombies, but that's as far as any direction goes there. This NPC near the tent mentions a path in the graveyard with a monster in it, but this is slightly misleading, as the player still needs something before progressing that way. This NPC talks about the zombie's big boss being addicted to fly honey, and this sign right nearby says to not set up tents without permission, which may indicate to the player to check out the tent, which is what they need to do next, but other than that, I'm drawing a blank. Genuinely, I can't find any other indication for why the player should come to this area. There's the hint guy, but you shouldn't need to literally pay to win. No, wait. This woman in black mentions it. And as far as I know, she's the only one who does. It feels like at this point several NPCs' dialogue should have changed to reflect this change in objective. This is a rare moment where I'll admit the game could do much better in leading the player. Sure, the tent could catch the player's eye due to it being something big that wasn't there before, but remember, there was just an entire sequence in another place for several minutes, and much of the prior activities in Threed up to this point have taken place in the northern part of town. It doesn't even get added to the town map. Won't drag this out, but this could have been easily addressed with some more dialogue added for the townspeople. Approaching the tent, a mini-boss is engaged, the Boogie Tent. I like that his battle background is made to look like the actual fabric of the tent, to tie the battle to the location it's happening. Here, the player will likely notice the third character's attack doesn't match that of the main character's physical strength or the power of the FemC's PSI, a cue to them that he is an item user, and seeing as running isn't an option from this battle and blunt force and magic are out, it's a natural place for the player to place their attention. And seeing as they've been given bottle rockets throughout Winters to use, even if they've already used them up, they now have a better idea of his role in combat. The battle isn't too long, and the tent's weakness to fire is an easily understandable one. The player is also tasked once again with training up their new recruit, with the third hero being slightly behind. But like areas in Happy Happy Village and Peaceful Rest Valley were designed to quickly do much of this for the player to train FemC, Winters was done to get the third hero for the most part caught up, probably only a few levels behind at this point. The player is then given the fly honey. The player is also likely going to want to equip the third hero with better armor, which they know is accessible at the shop, which will likely also draw them to the arms dealer, the primary source for effective items for the third hero to utilize. Eventually, the main protagonist receives a call from AppleKid, informing him that he has invented zombie paper, and he's sending it your way. How convenient. AppleKid explicitly mentions placing it on the ground to use it, and if the player goes back to the circus tent where the headquarters for getting rid of the zombies is, which isn't much of a stretch, they'll find NPCs who make it clear what to do. After doing this, the player needs to stay at the hotel to trigger the next cutscene of the zombies getting trapped. Not the most obvious thing to do, but the NPCs inside do say things about waiting, and she even uses the words "wake up tomorrow morning," so it is there, and resting isn't something the average player wouldn't do after fighting a mini-boss. And seeing as the player will get AppleKid's call before reaching it, I say it functions well enough. The next day, by the way, I hate how outside the color palette's different. Breaks the immersion a bit. Anyway, the player will go to the tent to see what came of the zombies and see them all like this. I love that dialogue was written for the zombies in this state. It's all great. And with this guy right near the tent talking about the underground path, the next objective is clear: to get where the zombies were guarding before. Over there, the path is open and down we go. From here, the player enters the literal catacombs of Threed. It's a straightforward path with appropriately themed enemies throughout. I also like that they tailored the presents to this section as well, being coffins, and that they placed the silver bracelet inside a coffin, sorta like how people are buried with jewelry. It's just clever and cute, for a coffin. At the end of the mini dungeon, the player engages in a fight with the mini barf, who's honestly just a little guy. He can be annoying though, by inflicting crying status on the whole party, rendering them unable to attack more frequently than not. Though not tied to the setting, I like that his battle background is made to look like him. Just makes it all the more gross. His theme also samples the Super Mario Bros. Theme, which I really don't even know what to draw from that. We are underground, like several levels in the NES game, but maybe it's because he vaguely resembles a Goomba? I digress. After defeating him, he reiterates Master Belch's craze for fly honey, clearly indicating it's something to remember. Outside, the sound of running water can be heard from the nearby stream. There's also this guy to buy items from, including a calorie stick, which is just hilarious in concept. The atmosphere of this area is great, and it's a nice distance from all the towns the player has been through so far. It really feels like you've escaped from Threed for the time being. The salesman mentions a village is just upstream with several interesting people, a place called Saturn Valley, not found on any map. Though the music chugs on with its dangerous sound, the water running evens it out nicely, to be a sort of simultaneous reprieve from the oppressive feel of Threed, while making it clear there's still danger out there. Likewise, the inhabiting enemies are still zombies and also nature-themed. Upstream and past a cave, there's a picture, and the waterfall, clearly able to be gone through with something behind it. With no way forward, heading back, the only way to go is the aforementioned cave. Only violent roaches inhabit the cave and give lots of experience. That'll help our new party member catch up nicely, if he were alive. Strange music can be heard in the distance, breaking into the usual cave theme. Let's see what it is.